So hello everyone, and I think a few more people will be just popping in as we get started here, but thank you for joining us this afternoon for the University of Regina's 2024 Alumni Effect Virtual Speaker Series. My name is Arliss Quering, and I work in library reference and instruction and coordinate events like the Archer Book Club at the University of Regina Library. I'm also an alumna of the Department of Music and the Faculty of Arts, and a current grad student in interdisciplinary studies, so it's a wonderfully busy time for me at the U of R as well. So before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to acknowledge that the University of Regina is situated on the territories of the Nehiyawak, the Anishinaapiaq, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis-Michif Nation. The University of Regina is on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. The University of Regina's Alumni Engagement Department is pleased to be able to offer the Alumni Effect speaker series virtually. This is my first time hosting a lecture in this series, and I hope that your time with us today inspires you to return for future sessions. And also the Archer Book Club as well. If you happen to be interested, alumni are very welcome as well. I would like to point out that these sessions are being recorded and will be posted on the U of R alumni website so that you can watch the presentations again or share them with your friends and family. You'll see the link to the alumni website in the chat shortly if you'd like to access the video later. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the 2024 Alumni Effect Virtual Speaker Series, Guy Vanderhaeghe. Guy, thank you so much for joining us. Guy is a three-time, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Just a wonderful introduction for you here that we've got. Guy is a three-time winner of the Governor General's Award for English language fiction for his collections of short stories, Man, Descending and Daddy Lenin, and for his novel, The Englishman's Boy, which was also shortlisted for the Giller Prize and the International Dublin Literary Award. His novel, The Last Crossing, was a winner of the CBC's Canada Reads competition, and August into Winter, his most recent novel, I'm about a third of the way in myself, won the Saskatchewan Book Award for Fiction and the Glengarry Book Award. He has also received the Timothy Findlay Prize, the Harbourfront Literary Prize, and the Cheryl and Henry Kloppenberg Prize, all given for a body of work. Today, Guy will discuss his career path from studying education at the University of Regina to becoming a national literary treasure. Following his presentation, we have about 15 minutes or so for a question and answer session. So we would invite you to submit any questions you have for Guy in the chat, and I'll read them to him following our discussion. You're welcome to leave your cameras on for the duration of the event if you wish to, but please note that your microphone will remain muted until the end of the presentation. If you'd like us to ask a question live at the end of the presentation, please just use your raise hand function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do what we can to include everyone as much as possible. And now I'm going to turn the floor over to Guy Vanderhaeghe. So
thank you very much, for your lovely introduction. As I've already forewarned Arliss, being a writer, I need to write whatever I'm going to say. So I have written a brief presentation that touches on my time at the University of Regina and how I believe it influenced my development as a writer. Some of my remarks might sound as if they're directed entirely to students, but they're not meant to be. So I will just spring into what I've written. When I received the invitation to speak in the series, The Alumni Effect, I naturally wondered how relevant my experience at the University of Regina would be to anyone currently attending it. There is, given my age, a great gap between the then and the now. In fact, I received my BEd in the College of Education in 1978, long before many of those who may now be listening were ever born. Needless to say, in the years intervening between when I graduated and today, not only has the University of Regina changed a great deal, but so has the world. The other thing that gave me pause about how helpful anything I have to say might be is that my career path has been a relatively unusual one. The majority of my life has been passed imagining things, in writing fiction, short stories, novels, plays, and once even a television miniseries. Activities that many people think of as frivolous and unproductive. My life has taken a very different course than I thought it would when I enrolled in the College of Education 46 years ago with plans to spend my working life as a high school teacher. After a little reflection, I thought the best thing I might talk about today is, and here I date myself once again, the line in the old John Lennon song, Beautiful Boy, where he says, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. What I'd like to emphasize is that even if your life assumes a different shape and different destination than the one you expect it to take now, your experience at the University of Regina is likely to serve you well in ways you cannot predict. No matter what you study, even if it doesn't have an obvious specific application to whatever profession or professions you might follow in later life, it won't be wasted education. Which is just another way of saying that I believe a university education is never just about job training. It's also about enriching your experience of the world, about making you a more nimble and flexible thinker, about exciting your curiosity and instilling an eagerness to continue learning even after you have that degree clutched in your hot little hand. Unfortunately, I'll have to refer to myself and my own experience at the University of Regina to illustrate the point about the unexpected benefits that may accrue to you from your time there. So bear with me as I stroll down memory lane. And I need to add, you may not realize what these unanticipated benefits are today, and that only someday in the future, when you pause to take stock of your life and the importance of a particular class or a particular professor to who and what you became, does it dawn on you. I believe this is commonly referred to as the butterfly effect, the notion that even a tiny event such as a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon can have big consequences very far afield, that it may breed hurricanes. Looking back, I think that small events at the U of R back in 1978 that I scarcely noted had influence in my becoming a writer. But first, I have to reveal some unflattering information about my state of mind when I entered the College of Education as a student. My motives might be seen as a bit cynical. The only thing I was interested in was getting a piece of paper that would provide me with qualifications to land a job. In 1978, I was coming off a long and dispiriting period of unemployment and underemployment. After receiving an MA in history from the University of Saskatchewan, I had worked as a library assistant in the University of Saskatchewan archives. However, when my wife was offered a position in the research and planning branch of the Provincial Department of Health, a job that paid much better than my position at the archives, we moved to Regina. But for me, that set off a long, unsuccessful attempt to find work. And while I looked for work, I attempted, equally unsuccessfully, to make a stab at writing fiction. As the long list of rejections for jobs I had applied for accumulated, so too did rejection letters from editors to whom I was sending the short stories I wrote during my enforced leisure. After many months of this, I realized I was a spectacular failure on two fronts. But the failure that stung most was that there was nobody in the literary world ready to take me seriously as a writer. So I told myself I needed to grow up, be sensible, face reality, and make a more concerted, focused effort to train myself for a career people would recognize as normal, a worthwhile pursuit. And since the only thing I could envision doing aside from writing was teaching, I enrolled in the College of Education. My assumption was that since I had an MA in history, I was a natural fit to teach social studies. But here I encountered one of those peculiar bureaucratic glitches that infest every large institution. To qualify as a high school teacher of social studies and obtain a Bachelor of Education, I would need to study 2 years. Whereas despite having fewer university English classes than history classes, if I opted to teach high school English, I could get my BEd in 1 year if I attended intersession and summer school. I chose the swiftest route to gainful employment. To tell the truth, I knew there were plenty of teachers, especially in rural Saskatchewan where I'd grown up, who had jobs teaching outside the fields they had specialized in. And I reasoned that if I took the language arts classes, which would speed me to a degree in a single year, that was a price I would willingly pay. When I left the U of R, I would cast around and see if there was anyone who would hire me as a social studies teacher. My attitude was practical. Do enough to pass classes I didn't particularly want to take, serve my time, collect my piece of paper, and get my release. Obviously, I started out in the College of Education with a less than enthusiastic frame of mind. My guess is that my recent history of rejection had left me cast down, maybe even mildly depressed about how my attempts to write fiction had come to nothing. Becoming a writer had been something of an unvoiced dream for me. I didn't expect much when I registered in the College of Education beyond job qualifications, but then I encountered two remarkable profs who taught language arts, Sandra Wittick and Joe Duffy. The first thing I noted about them was how obviously and passionately they loved what they were attempting to teach us to teach, composition and English literature. Of course, I had an affection for these things too. After all, I had long harbored a desire to write. But I was being given a new perspective on writing from people who wanted to awaken in future teachers a curiosity about the history of the English language and of the history of English literature. Now, we were not likely to teach teenagers these topics in detail, but Wittick and Duffy believed that it was good to know more about your subject than you would ever be called on to deliver to students. The depth of your knowledge was like the 9/10 of the iceberg that wasn't visible, but which supported everything above the waterline. Sandra Wittick wanted her students to have some grasp about the etymology of English words. She had been educated in Britain, where students were instructed in how English had evolved over time. If I remember correctly, there was some resistance to this among my fellow education students because they thought all of this was immaterial to what they would be required to do in the classroom. But in the end, I think she brought most people around to her way of thinking. She certainly had that effect on me. Until Sandra Wittick's class, I had never given a thought to how the words I wrote and spoke every day had altered their meaning over time, even their pronunciation according to geographical location. How these words had a story was what she emphasized. It's odd what I can recall from my days sitting in a U of R classroom 45 years ago. Small details that on the surface might appear trivial and unimportant, but made an impression on me. I remember one very cold January morning, Professor Wittick telling us that while contemporary English had retained a strong resemblance to the Old English words for animals, such as pig, cow, sheep, the words used for the meat of those animals was very close to the Old French words for the animals, as it was spoken by the Norman conquerors of England. For instance, mutton had its root in the French word mouton, pork derived from the French word pour, beef from boeuf. Her explanation for this was that the Anglo-Saxons, who were servants at the tables of Norman nobility, knew the Old English words for the animal, but when they served the meat of those animals to their masters, the French word for the beast got confused with the meat. I have no idea if this is the case, but a quick search of the internet just the other day suggests that it is in fact the case. Now, I admit that this little tidbit of information was scarcely earth-shattering information. So why did it fix itself in my mind? I think it was because it made me see writing in a slightly different way. It made me become more sensitive to words themselves, to realize that words were the building blocks of language and they were to be cared for their own sake. Up until then, I had felt that writing fiction was all about narrative, about telling stories. But maybe Sandra Whittick's emphasis on word origins suggested to me that I ought to have greater respect for the words that I had been using to create the short stories I struggled to write. Maybe if I thought a little bit more about how they had come to be, I would deploy them with a little more care. Slowly, I was becoming interested in language in and of itself. Professor Whittick stoked that interest by having her students choose a word and write a short essay on its etymology. She also insisted that we purchase a good dictionary that provided some etymological information for each of its entries. And she insisted we use that dictionary whenever we encountered a word with which we weren't familiar. Sometimes she would put us on the spot by asking us the meaning of a word that had appeared in one of the handouts she gave us. All too often, nobody could answer her queries. But I see now that she turned me into a lifelong dictionary user. I still have the dictionary that I bought for her class, Webster's 9th New Collegiate Dictionary. And that dictionary has been supplemented by many others, including the relatively new Oxford Canadian Dictionary, which wasn't even in existence when I was a university student in 1978. That dictionary provides Canadianisms that don't exist in other versions of World English. And clearly, a Canadian writer ought to know something about the Canadian English that surrounds him. Joe Duffy was another remarkable professor of language arts at the U of R. Like his colleague Sandra Whittick, he was immersed in his subject, but as was she, he was also a person with a deep interest in the other arts. He was a fan of opera, and whether or not you shared his passion, it was a treat to hear him talk about it with unbridled passion. Sandra Whittick was equally passionate about visual art as Joe Duffy was about music. She and her husband had an extensive collection of English studio pottery, a collection that she bequeathed to the Mackenzie Art Gallery, where she volunteered as a docent. They both wanted their students, many of whom came from rural areas where there had been little exposure to the fine arts, to sample widely in all areas of human expression. Joe Duffy believed that teachers of English literature ought to have some grasp of the history of literature in English. He would often give his classes oral quizzes in which he would read a quotation from a major writer from the past and ask us to identify who it was. Although we failed hopelessly in these identity quizzes, I gradually came to see that what Duffy was trying to do was at least get us to be able to place the writers roughly in the time periods in which they wrote by the distinctive language they used, to give us some sense, just as Whittick was doing, that writing was both individual expression, but also the expression of the age in which it was created. Writers writing in the same period might sound different from one another. Hemingway had a different voice than Virginia Woolf's, but nevertheless, they wrote 19th century English. While in they wrote 20th century English, I'm sorry, while the 19th century employed a language that was still English but bore a distinct tone and flavor. 20th century writers couldn't or shouldn't write like Dickens, but it was useful for someone like me who wanted to write to realize I was part of a long tradition. Finally, Wittig and Duffy had high standards when it came to assigning a grade for written work. Until then, most of my essay writing had involved writing history papers. It wasn't that history profs didn't note glaring grammatical errors, but they weren't particularly sensitive to language. All they required you to do was to write a clear, practical prose. Composing a paper for Wittig or Duffy was a different kind of trial, one that demanded care in regard to grammar, word choice, even style. Nobody before had ever passed judgment on my prose style before. These profs were language experts and were alert to crimes against it, crimes they had no hesitation in pointing out to you. I had always considered myself, in quotation marks, a good writer. So getting back a paper that identified not only grammatical slips, but infelicities of phrasing was a sobering experience for me. They asked and required of me to do better. There is much more I could say about these two people, but time doesn't permit it. I ought to note with gratitude that both became mentors of a kind for me. Joe Duffy even helped me land a part-time job writing short biographical pieces on English writers that were broadcast on the radio educational service that the province ran in those long ago days. Still, I never mastered the courage to confess to these profs that I harbored a dirty little secret, that I hoped one day to become a writer of fiction. Years later at some book event, Sandra Wittig came up to me, gave me a wry little smile and said, "After I read your first book, I wondered what must have been going through your head as you sat so silently in class way back then. Whatever it was that was running through my head would have been entirely complimentary when it came to her." As I said earlier, I didn't necessarily realize how important my experiences in the College of Education would be for me. I finished my degree and went off to teach English and social studies in a rural high school. I didn't last long as a high school teacher. My wife wanted to go back to university and study art, but when we moved to Saskatoon, full-time jobs in the city public school system were very scarce. I worked as a substitute teacher for a time, kept writing, and 4 years after leaving the U of R, I published my first book, a collection of short stories called Man Descending. Thinking about my brief time in the College of Education, I realize now how Wittig and Duffy had reinvigorated in surprising ways my approach to writing, and how they had helped dispel my despair over a long period of rejection letters. When I started writing again, I wrote with more care and attention than I ever had before. I imagined those two people looking over my shoulder. That made a difference. Although I didn't continue as a high school teacher, I did become a part-time university teacher, first of history, later of creative writing. When I stepped into a classroom, Wittig and Duffy were my models. They had always done their best to serve their students, but they also had served their subject. And in doing that, and doing that means treating the body of knowledge you are supposed to have a hand in imparting with the utmost respect, and in turn, that also means pressing your students to do their best, to demand they stretch their willingness to learn. In the days I attended the University of Regina, faculty put great emphasis on teaching. I suspect the same is true today because strong institutions uphold their traditions. I hope for anyone who may happen to be a student that is listening today that you will be as lucky as I was in the profs you have. But I'll add a caveat to that and say you may not know what effect what you are taught will have on you until many years after you receive your degree. Be patient. Sooner or later, the unexpected benefits of your education will reveal themselves. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was very inspiring. I love all of your references to the etymology of words. It's something my spouse's primary language is Spanish, and we're often discussing the different relationships of words and things like that. And it's just absolutely fascinating. So if anybody wants to pop in any questions in the chat, you're welcome to do so, or raise your hand. I'll try to keep an eye on things here for any raised hands. In the meantime, we'll get things started here with just a couple of questions from our team here. Um, Let me see here. Well, I mean, as I mentioned, the speech was very inspiring as well here, but you're an inspiration to many writers in Canada and around the world. Do you have some writers that have informed your own writing beyond what you mentioned in the presentation, and how have they inspired you?
That's a very interesting question, but it's also a difficult question. I mean,
Yes.
I often say there are writers who tend to be sort of staples for me, and it depends on what kind of writing I'm talking about. So for me, the two biggest inspirations for the short story were Canada's own Alice Munro and Flannery O'Connor. They're writers that I constantly turn to for inspiration and also to learn something about how to write short stories. Mostly, I'm inspired by what I'm reading at the moment, and as I get older, I re-inspire myself by rereading books that were really important to me when I was younger. So, for instance, you know, not too long ago, I reread Tolstoy's War and Peace. I reread a lot of Dostoevsky, Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot. So I, th I think that writers feed their enthusiasm for writing by reading.
Mhm.
And if you don't do that, you can't hope to write. Um, I used to have students who would say to me, I don't read very much because I don't want to be influenced. And I would say, yes, you do. You do want to be influenced, and you want to be influenced in the best possible way. And that's by reading the best people you can read.
Mhm.
If you thought of sports analogies, people wouldn't be saying, like back in the days of Wayne Gretzky, I don't watch Gretzky play hockey because I don't want to be influenced. Part of finding your own voice as a writer actually means working through other people's voices. And in working through other people's voices, I think you find your own voice.
Mhm. Absolutely. I remember in a creative writing class I took that the professor had said that a lot of writing is in response to other writers. Like you're not really writing to the public, you might be writing to yourself, but you're also responding to who you've read to before. So I love the idea of like learning to write through reading as well. You mentioned that, your current reading is influencing your writing. Do you have any writers that you're reading right now or?
Well, yeah, I usually don't do this. I might be giving something away. I, I, I want to attempt to write in the tradition of the hard-boiled detective novel, um, partly tongue-in-cheek, and partly putting certain twists on it. I don't know if anything will come of it,
Mhm.
you know, but in preparing myself to write that sort of thing, I'm reading, obvious people like Dashiell Hammett, Raymond Chandler, Dorothy B. Hughes, Patricia Highsmith. I'm trying to get a sense not only not not only on how you construct the kind of plot that these novels often demonstrate, but also how you recreate that atmosphere.
Absolutely. So we have a couple of questions in the chat here. So first from Faye, any tips for getting published? And I believe they're also curious if you do happen to have an agent and if, how one goes about getting an agent, if you have any tips on sort of the industry.
Yeah, I do have an agent. Um, and the unfortunate thing about publishing and agents now in this country, which has changed a great deal from when I became, it's very hard to get an entry to a larger trade publisher if your work isn't submitted by an agent. That said, it's very difficult to get an agent. I mean, agents are inundated um, by people who are submitting their work to them, hoping that they will pick them up and take them as a client. I don't mean to be discouraging, but what I would say is the way to get an agent is to write something that's really, really good, right? And to write something that's really, really good, um, you have to work very hard at it. So I think it's kind of important not to put the cart before the horse. I think a lot of people worry more about getting published than about doing the work that would get you published. And by that I mean doing something that's striking enough, interesting enough, um, enthralling enough that a publisher or an agent would say, I want to publish this. Or that they will say, I think that this will really interest people and really, really grip them. Having said that, what I would say is that there are books out there that list, or I shouldn't even say books anymore, internet. You can track down agents in Toronto, New York, virtually any place in the world. You can learn about what sort of work that they're looking for and how to make contact with them. So if you've arrived at the point where you really think that you've got something that's worthy, that's what you do. And what you have to do is you have to send some sample chapters of the best possible work that you can produce.
Absolutely. So, somewhat segueing into that, a bit of a bundle of questions from Shannon here. She mentioned self-publishing, which I know can be fairly divisive amongst authors. So, people are interested in self-publishing, and if you have any thoughts on that, it would be great if you could share. But also, I guess, somewhat related to what you were just saying is how one might go about distinguishing yourself from the many, many authors that are out there and, saying that what you want to say is something that others might want to read, and how do you sort of stand out amongst a crowd kind of thing, because there's so many of us that want to share stories.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I'm just glancing at Shannon's message.
Yeah, many
So
questions there. Thank you,
yeah.
Shannon.
So when Shannon says that she wants to write a book about her cousin, 19 children born in southern Saskatchewan, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, right there you have a topic that you can be pretty sure almost nobody else is writing about. Some people think that's a bad thing. Okay, I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing if you can, a topic never, a topic in itself never sells a book. What sells the book is how well that topic is written about. That's what sells a book. And often you'll be told by someone that you shouldn't do what you're doing. So probably one of my most successful books was a novel called The Englishman's Boy. When I started working on that, my publisher said, you shouldn't write that book. It's a Western. A serious writer does not write Westerns. I said, to hell with you. This is what I want to do. Okay. It's aiming work at a market is what I call a mug's game, right? Because by the time you get a book written, the market will have changed, right? So whatever you think might be hot at the moment may not be hot 3 years down the road. I remember way back in the 90s and the early 80s when Canadian writers were saying, I'm not making any money, right? So I'm going to make some money. I'm going to write a mystery. Okay. But the thing is that they couldn't write a mystery because they weren't interested in writing a mystery. And they didn't have the chops to write a mystery. It takes a certain kind of writer to write in any sort of vein, right? So the first thing that you have to, I used to tell my creative writing students, the first duty you have is to write a book that you would want to read. Not what somebody else would want to read, what you would want to read. And then hope that that will get you readers. I think there's a lot, or sometimes I see a lot of stuff online or even sort of like how to do writing books and things like that that tend to leave the impression that there's a number of things that you have to do to succeed and suggest that there's a key or a clue that if you just found that one key or that clue and you put it in the lock and you turned that key, the door would spring open and the world would be your oyster. I don't believe that. I believe that people need to be what I would call faithful to themselves. So any writer is likely to write the sort of thing that they like to read. Don't try to change yourself because you think that there might be a market for this or that.
Absolutely. I love that. It's just, especially in this sort of modern world of hustle culture and, trying to be the next big thing on TikTok and things like that. I think it's so important to stay true to yourself. That's absolutely wonderful. Well, I think we'll start to wrap up here. If anybody has any last minute questions, please do pop them in the chat. But we'll just remind everyone here of a couple of things. But so first of all, thank you everyone again for joining us today and for contributing to this wonderful conversation. And thank you so much, Guy, for sharing your story and for your time today. I also wanted to thank Alexis McEwen and the alumni team for coordinating everything today. It's been an absolutely lovely event. So just a general reminder that a video recording of today's Alumni Effect will be posted soon on the alumni section of the website. So the link can be found in the chat again there. And feel free to share that link with your family and friends. And don't forget to check out the University of Regina website and our social media channels for more information about upcoming events. The next Alumni Effect speaker event will be on February 20th. So just about a month from today. So stay tuned for more details on the alumni website about that. And I'm just going to double check if there are any more questions. I think we have some more links there and some thank yous. So until then, everyone, thank you again so much. Take care and thank you for tuning in. And thank you again, Guy.
Thank you.